is a true story from 2003. As Alan explores a narrow slot canyon, an accident occurs. He climbs over a large boulder, and suddenly the rock shifts. In a split second, Alan loses his footing and falls down the canyon. The boulder crashes down with him. It wedges between the canyon walls and traps his right hand beneath it. In panic, Alan tries to pull his arm out, even if it might break, but no matter how hard he pulls, he can't free himself desperately. He uses his other hand to push the boulder, but it won't budge even with all his strength. The rock stays in place, frustrated. Alan strikes the rock repeatedly, but it doesn't move. Exhausted from his attempts to free himself, Alan realizes that he is trapped. His energy begins to fade, and he knows he's losing the battle. After the desperate struggle to regain his strength, Alan grabbed his water cup and drank in big gulps. But as he drank, he suddenly stopped. You realize this would be his last cup, and after it there would be no more water. Alan began shouting toward the sky, hoping someone would hear him and come to his rescue. However, the deep, narrow crack where he was trapped, like a lonely dragon carved into the earth, blocked all sounds and hopes. Between the cold rocks, no sound could escape. Finally, Alan forced himself to stay calm and began thinking carefully about his next move. Alan emptied his backpack, laying each item carefully on the stone in front of him. After a moment of thought, he picked up a multifunctional tool. He slowly unfolded the knife from the tool and pressed his finger against the blade. However, it didn't seem sharp enough. He doubted whether it could be used to cut through his arm to free himself. But in that moment, Alan's main hope was to use the knife to carve away at the rock. He started chiseling the stone, but after a lot of effort, only a shallow mark appeared on its hard surface. After working for so long, Alan's hands grew sore and weak, causing the knife to slip and fall to the ground. He immediately tried to bend down and pick it up, but the injury to his arm made it impossible to move his waist properly. Desperate, he removed his shoes and socks, hoping to grab the knife with his toes. But his legs weren't long enough, and his toes couldn't reach the knife. Thinking quickly, Alan found a stick and tried to use it to reach the knife. Though he touched the knife, he couldn't pick it up, determined. He broke the end of the stick into a hook and finally retrieved the knife. Unfortunately, by this time, his hand had started turning black. Alan knew he had to act quickly to save his arm, so he kept chiseling at the rock late into the night. Without stopping whenever Alan felt hungry or thirsty, he would just stare at the water next to him until the clock struck midnight. Only then did he dare take a small sip from the kettle. Even that tiny sip had to be held in his mouth for a long time before he carefully swallowed and licked his lips. After this brief moment of refreshment, Alan tried throwing his safety belt toward the ledge. On the opposite side, after half an hour of effort, the belt finally caught on a rock. Using the belt, he secured himself, turned off his headlamp, stretched his muscles, and finally allowed himself to sleep. But dreams are often cruel. He woke up and realized he was still in the same place. Checking his watch, only 5 minutes had passed, but he was no longer tired. Determined to keep fighting, Alan picked up his knife and continued his struggle for survival. By early the next morning, he had made progress, but sadly, it still wasn't. As the first tree of sunlight entered the canyon, hope ignited in Alan's heart. He eagerly took a step forward, feeling like he had stepped out of a cold cage. He touched his eyes and nose, sensing the warmth of the sun. His arms slowly moved along the beam of light. As he did this, Alan felt lighter, almost as if he were watching the Sarisu, with his father snapping back to reality. He reminded himself not to give up. On the third day, Alan had a new idea. He made a pulley using his climbing rope and a carabiner, hoping to lift the stone just enough to free his arm. But even with all his strength, the rock didn't move at all. He then made 2 pedals and used both feet and his free arm to try again, but it was still no use. After spending the entire morning struggling, Alan, now thirsty, could only think of the bottle of water he left in his car miles away, helplessly touching his drive. After carefully saving the moment, Alan unscrewed the water cup. Just as he was about to take a drink, he suddenly felt the urge to urinate. Unprepared, he ended up wasting some of the precious water. Luckily, he managed to use a water bag to cast the next bit. Despite the strong smell, he knew he had no choice but to do this to survive. As only 150 milliliters of water remained in the kettle. If he hadn't done this, he would only be able to last under the next night. After many failed attempts to free himself, Alan, feeling helpless, resumed chiseling at the rock. But as he worked, he noticed his hands becoming more and more. He came up with a desperate idea. He removed the protective layer from a water pipe and tied it around his arm. Then he used a climbing buckle to fasten a plot, bend tightly around it finally. He pulled out a knife and attempted to cut into his arm, but the blade was too dull. Or perhaps his mind wouldn't let him do it, so he only managed to leave a few shallow marks. His arm had been trapped for 3 days, and his thoughts were growing more confused. With very little water left, he could only take small sips. But this time, after setting down the water cup, something went wrong in an instant. Alan felt as though his heart had been pierced by a knife. Staring at the little bit of water left, he felt even more tortured by the past few days. Alan began to hallucinate. He saw his girlfriend, but before he could unlock the door, a thunderclap woke him. Dark clouds over to the sky and rain started to fall. Alan opened his mouth, raising his cup to catch the rain. In that moment, he felt alive again. As the rain poured harder, water began to flood the canyon. It seemed like God had seen Alan suffering and was sending him relief. The water soon rose, reaching his mouth. Without wasting a moment, Alan dived into the water, using all his strength and a buoyancy to lift the stone off his arm. In that instant, he escaped death. He then floated in the canyon for an unknown amount of time. Finally, he found an opportunity to escape. Struggling to get out of the canyon, he reached his beloved car and, despite his pain, made his way to his girlfriend's house. But instead of helping him, she cruelly locked him out. At that moment, the dream ended. It turned out everything had been a hallucination. On the 4th day, Alan began to reflect on his life. In front of the camera, he realized that his willfulness over the years had caused the most pain to his parents. If given another chance, he would make sure to honor them. After seeing this, Alan picked up his water cup and drank the last drops of water, even licking the remaining whey from the walls of the cup. Then he took out a knife and stabbed it into his arm. Though the pain was intense, Alan didn't scream. He had to adapt to this feeling, because next he needed to slide the knife and cut off his arm. But cruelly, the dull knife was blocked by his bone. No matter how hard he tried, it was useless. Alan had no choice but to pull out the knife, press the wound, and put his finger in his mouth. It was still a mess, but it temporarily quenched his thirst. On the 5th day, desperate to survive, Alan began drinking his own urine. He couldn't take big guns like with water, but sipping it slowly was unbearable. The taste was so horrible that he felt like wanting, but Alan forced himself to keep going. Afterward, he carved the words, "Rest here" by Alan Rolston into the rock wall. As his will to survive grew weaker and weaker, beautiful fantasies once again began to appear before his eyes. Suddenly, Alan's attention was drawn to the appearance of a sofa, and then he saw his parents. Soon his entire family appeared before him, perhaps representing his deepest dream. On the 6th day, Alan woke up from his despair and saw the sofa again, but this time he saw his future child. This vision reignited his will to survive. He pushed harder and harder until he finally broke free. Filled with hope, he kept working and succeeded. Alan shouted with joy, seizing the moment. He quickly took out his knife. What followed was so brutal that even the strongest couldn't bear to witness it. Twice, after several attempts, Alan finally succeeded. Alan took a picture of his remaining arm. Then, gathering all his equipment and enduring the pain, he crossed the deep canyon. Finally, he emerged under the scorching sun. He removed his heart and looked up at the sky and the last horizon. Alan told himself that he had not given up, that he had succeeded, and as long as he continued to fight, luck would eventually be on his side. In the next moment, Alan found a water hose under the rock wall. When he turned around, he spotted an iron ring left by those before him. Overjoyed, Alan lay on the ground and kissed the island ring. He then used a climbing rope to descend the rock wall. Lunging into the water balloon, he filled a cup and drank it all. 1 cup turned into another and then 3 more. Once his thirst was quenched, Alan picked up his full cup, discarded all his equipment, and began his journey to leave. But in his current physical condition, walking out of the enormous canyon on just 2 feet seemed impossible, especially now that the water was gone. Alan moved through the canyon, his breath ragged, often collapsing from dizziness, only to stand back up and push forward. With show will parver, he ignored the pain in his arm, even as it bled continuously. As Alan was about to faint again, he saw figures in front of him, bloody but real. He forced himself to stay conscious, adjusting his focus. The pedestrians ran towards him, and Alan, barely able to speak, told them how he had broken free, and that he needed water. The kind stranger, shocked by his condition, immediately gave him water. Alan grabbed the kettle and drank it all. Without wasting any time, he continued his journey. Refusing to stop, he met more people, drinking water from them as well. Eventually, Alan collapsed, exhausted, unable to hear anything happening around him. A gust of wind stirred him, and as he looked up, a helicopter came into view, the most beautiful sight he had ever seen. Alan was finally saved. His story quickly spread across the country, and what had once been a dream had now become reality. This is a true story to this day. Alan still climbs rocks, Continuing his passion for adventure,